A reclusive millionaire, Julian Vance, returned to his ancestral home only to be paralyzed by the sight of the little boy next door lying twisted on the lawn. The boy's mother was standing over him, not with concern, but with a cold, dismissive glare, her new boyfriend's arm wrapped possessively around her shoulders. Why would a child cry out that he couldn't walk in his own yard? And who was the real monster hiding behind the perfectly manicured hedges? Julian had come back to the sprawling stone manor of his youth for solitude, a commodity his fortune could buy but never truly guarantee. The house, set back from the road by a long cypress-lined drive, was a fortress against a world that had taken everything from him years ago. A wife, a daughter, a reason to engage with the messy tapestry of human life. He had spent a decade building a tech empire from the ashes of his grief, a distraction of code and capital that left him hollow but immensely wealthy. Now, at 42, he was done running. He sought the quiet ghosts of his past, hoping their familiar whispers would be more comforting than the roaring silence of his life. The house next door was a stark contrast to his Gothic estate. It was a modern symphony of glass and white plaster, a place that screamed of new money and curated happiness. He knew the woman's name was Eleanor, and her son was a small, quiet boy named Leo. Julian had only seen them in passing, a flash of bright color against the muted greens and grays of his own property. But something about the house felt wrong. The lawn was too green, the windows too clean, the silence from the yard too profound. A home with a 5-year-old boy should have been a source of ambient noise, shouts of joy, the thud of a kicked ball, the high-pitched arguments with imaginary friends. But from that house there was nothing. It was a silence that felt less like peace and more like suppression. He first noticed the man a month after moving in. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He drove a low-slung sports car that would growl up the shared driveway, and he draped himself over Eleanor like a statement piece. Julian watched from his study window as the man, Marcus, directed Leo in the yard. His instructions were crisp, devoid of warmth. Stand up straight. Don't drag your feet. Throw the ball properly. The boy's movements were jerky, hesitant, his small body tight with a tension no child should carry. Leo never seemed to be playing. He seemed to be performing and always falling short of the mark. That was the backdrop to the moment that shattered Julian's carefully constructed isolation. It was a Saturday afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the immaculate lawns. Julian was on his veranda, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand, when he saw them emerge. Marcus was carrying a new, brightly colored plastic climbing frame. He assembled it with an air of theatrical benevolence while Eleanor watched, her smile as fragile as spun glass. Leo stood to the side, his hands clenched at his sides, watching the structure go up not with anticipation, but with something that looked like dread. Julian's gut clenched. He remembered assembling a swing set for his own daughter, the memory a sharp, bittersweet pang. Her squeals of delight had been the soundtrack to his life. Leo's silence was a void. Marcus gestured for the boy to climb. "Go on," he said, his voice carrying on the still air. "It's for you. Show us how much you like it." Leo took a tentative step forward, his eyes darting towards his mother. She gave a weak, encouraging nod, her gaze flickering towards Marcus. The boy placed a small sneaker on the first rung. He was clumsy, his limbs uncoordinated with fear. He pulled himself up one level, then another, his small frame trembling. He reached the top, a small platform no more than 4 feet off the ground, and hesitated. "Now slide down," Marcus commanded. "Don't just stand there." Leo turned, his movements stiff. His foot slipped. It wasn't a dramatic fall, more of an awkward tumble, a clumsy collapse onto the soft, forgiving grass. It was the kind of fall that should have resulted in a surprised yelp and maybe a scraped knee. But Leo didn't yelp. He let out a piercing scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror and pain. He clutched his ankle, his small face contorted. "Mom!" he wailed, the word a desperate plea. "Mom, I can't walk. It hurts. I can't walk." Julian shot to his feet, the glass tumbling from his hand and shattering on the flagstones. He saw Marcus's reaction first. It was not concern. It was pure, unadulterated annoyance. His handsome face tightened into a mask of contempt. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Leo," he snapped. "Get up. You're not hurt. Stop being such a baby." Eleanor rushed forward, but Marcus put a hand on her arm, stopping her. "Leave him," he said, his voice low and menacing. "He needs to learn not to be so dramatic." Eleanor froze, her face a battleground of maternal instinct and fear. She looked down at her crying son, then up at the cold eyes of the man beside her. She chose fear. "Marcus is right, sweetie," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "Try to stand up. You're okay." But Leo only sobbed harder, curling into a fetal position on the grass. "I can't. I can't." That was the breaking point. The image of the child, abandoned in his pain just feet from his own mother, ignited a protective rage in Julian that had lain dormant for a decade. The ghosts in his mansion screamed in unison. He moved without thinking, vaulting over the low stone wall that separated their properties. His long strides ate up the distance in seconds. He didn't slow until he was standing over them, his large frame casting a shadow that eclipsed Marcus completely. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of thunder. "That's enough." Marcus and Eleanor flinched, turning to him in surprise. Marcus's face shifted from annoyance to arrogant indignation. "Excuse me? This is a private family matter." Julian ignored him, his eyes fixed on the small, sobbing boy. He knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate, the way one would approach a frightened animal. "Hey, Leo," he said softly. "My name is Julian. I'm your neighbor. Can you tell me where it hurts the most?" Leo flinched away, his eyes wide with terror, looking past Julian to Marcus. Julian didn't press. He saw the terror. He understood. He rose to his full height and looked directly at Eleanor, his gaze bypassing Marcus as if he were a piece of furniture. "Call an ambulance." Now, his voice was not a request. It was an order forged in boardrooms and battlefields, an undeniable command. Eleanor flinched again, her hand flying to her mouth. Marcus stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Now, you listen here. You have no right to come onto my property and—" Julian's head snapped towards him, and for the first time, Marcus saw the cold, lethal stillness in the millionaire's eyes. It was an emptiness that promised devastating consequences. "I won't ask again," Julian said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more threatening than a shout. "Your son is injured. Get him help or I will." He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the dial pad. The threat was clear. He wouldn't just call an ambulance, he would call the police. He would bring the world crashing down on their perfect little house. Marcus's bravado evaporated, replaced by a flicker of panicked calculation. He gave Eleanor a sharp nod. With trembling fingers, she finally dialed the number. As the siren grew in the distance, Julian knelt beside Leo again, not touching him, but simply being a quiet, solid presence. In that moment he made a silent, unbreakable vow. "I will find out what is happening in this house, and I will burn it to the ground to keep this child safe." At the hospital, the performance began. Marcus transformed into the model of a concerned future stepfather. He charmed the nurses, spoke to the doctor with an easy confidence, and explained that Leo was a highly sensitive boy, prone to exaggeration. Eleanor, a pale ghost in his orbit, nodded along, her eyes downcast. "He's always been a bit clumsy," she murmured, the words sounding rehearsed. The doctor, a weary but thorough man named Dr. Evans, examined Leo's ankle. It was a severe sprain, not a break, but painful nonetheless. As he gently palpated the boy's leg, he paused, his brow furrowing. He glanced at Julian, who stood silently in the corner of the examination room, an unmovable sentinel. "There are some older bruises here," Dr. Evans said, his tone carefully neutral as he pointed to a series of faint, yellowish marks on Leo's calf and shin. In various stages of healing, Marcus laughed, a sound too loud for the small room. He's all boy, doctor. Tumbles off his bike, runs into tables. You know how it is. Julian's eyes narrowed. He had never once seen a bicycle in Leo's yard. He'd never seen the boy run. Dr. Evans made a note in his chart, his expression unreadable. He asked Leo a few simple questions, but the boy only shook his head, burying his face in his mother's side, refusing to speak. When they were discharged, Marcus clapped Julian on the shoulder with a false camaraderie. "Hey man, thanks for the concern. We really appreciate it. Sorry if I was a little tense back there. You understand." A father's worry, the word father was a poison dart, and Julian felt it land. He looked past Marcus to Leo, whose eyes were wide and fixed on him. In them, Julian saw not the gratitude of a rescued child, but the desperate, silent plea of a prisoner being returned to his cell. The drive home was a blur of righteous fury. Julian's mind, usually occupied with market projections and investment strategies, was now a whirring engine of tactical planning. This wasn't a business deal. It was a rescue mission. He started by doing what he did best, gathering intelligence. He hired a private investigator, a discreet former federal agent he kept on retainer, to dig into Marcus Thorne's life. The preliminary report came back within 48 hours and painted a grim picture. Marcus was a grifter, a chameleon who attached himself to wealthy, vulnerable women. He had a string of failed businesses, lawsuits for unpaid debts, and 2 previous fiancées who had mysteriously broken off their engagements after losing significant amounts of money. There were no criminal charges, no accusations of violence. He was clever. He operated in the gray areas, leaving emotional and financial wreckage in his wake, but always staying just inside the lines of the law. But Julian knew that what was happening to Leo wasn't in a gray area. It was a stark, brutal black. He needed more than a background check. He needed proof of what was happening behind that pristine white door. He turned his attention to the most likely witness, the elderly woman who lived on the other side of Eleanor's house, a widow named Mrs. Gable. He'd seen her tending her roses, her movements slow and careful. He approached her one morning as she was trimming her hedges, the very picture of suburban tranquility. "Mrs. Gable," he began, his voice gentle. "I'm Julian Vance, from next door." She gave him a nervous, watery smile. "Oh yes, the new owner of the old Beaumont place. It's lovely to see someone living there again." He got straight to the point, knowing that dancing around the subject would only frighten her more. "I'm worried about the little boy, Leo." Her smile vanished. Her hands, holding the shears, trembled slightly. "He's a sweet boy," she said, her eyes darting towards Eleanor's house as if the walls themselves had ears. "Very quiet." "That's what worries me," Julian said, keeping his voice low. "I saw what happened the other day." With his fall, Mrs. Gable's face paled. She began snipping at a phantom branch, refusing to meet his eyes. "Children fall," she whispered. "It's what they do. And do their mothers stand by and do nothing while a stranger screams at them?" Julian countered softly. The question hung in the air between them. He saw the truth in her eyes, the conflict, the fear. She was afraid of Marcus. He had that effect on people. Julian didn't push her. He simply placed a business card on the hedge between them. "If you ever see or hear anything that concerns you, please call me, day or night. That little boy deserves to have someone looking out for him." He turned and walked away, leaving the card sitting on a green leaf. He knew she would take it. 2 nights later, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He answered. "Hello." A shaky, whispering voice came through the line. "Mr. Vance? It's Martha Gable." He could hear her terror. "He's screaming at the boy, Marcus. He's been doing it for an hour. Something about a spilled glass of juice. He called him stupid, worthless. I can hear the boy crying. He does this all the time, but tonight it's worse." The rage was a physical thing, a hot coil in Julian's stomach. "Thank you for calling me, Martha. You did the right thing. Is there anything else?" Her voice broke. "Before that man moved in, Leo used to play in the yard. He used to laugh. I haven't heard that boy laugh in 6 months. The line went dead. That was it. That was the confirmation. Now he had to get the proof that would stand up in court. Julian's fortune afforded him access to technology that bordered on the clandestine. Within a day, a security consultant who was actually a former signals intelligence expert from Julian's military days arrived. Under the cover of darkness, they installed a series of discreet, high-powered surveillance devices on Julian's property, all aimed at the house next door. Long-range microphones that could isolate conversations through glass, thermal cameras that could detect movement within the house, and a single high-definition camera concealed in a birdhouse, focused on the back patio and living room window, the two places Marcus seemed to favor for his tirades. Julian became a ghost, a warden watching his own prison. He spent hours in his study, monitoring the feeds, the quiet hum of the electronics a stark contrast to the ugly, raw humanity he was witnessing. He heard Marcus belittle Eleanor, chipping away at her confidence until she was a shell, entirely dependent on his approval. But his true venom was reserved for Leo. The verbal abuse was relentless, a constant drip of poison. "You're pathetic. Why can't you do anything right? No wonder your real father left." Then, he got the evidence that would change everything. It was a week after the fall. Leo was limping around the living room, his ankle still wrapped. Julian watched on the monitor as Marcus, holding a can of beer, watched the boy with cold disdain. "That ankle is fine," Marcus sneered. "You're faking it for attention. We're going to toughen you up." He grabbed Leo by the arm and forced him to stand in the middle of the room. "Now you're going to stand on that foot. Just that one. For 5 minutes. Don't move." The video feed was crystal clear. Julian could see the terror in Leo's eyes, the tears welling up as he tried to put weight on the injured joint. He wobbled, crying out in pain. "I can't, Marcus. It hurts." Eleanor, in the background, wrung her hands. "Marcus, maybe we should wait." "Stay out of this, Eleanor," he snarled without looking at her. "He needs to learn." Leo collapsed, sobbing, onto the floor. Marcus stared down at him for a long moment, then calmly took a sip of his beer. "Fine. If you're going to be a baby, you can do it in your room." He hauled the boy to his feet and dragged him out of the camera's view. The microphone, however, picked up the sound of a door slamming and a lock clicking. Then, the most heartbreaking sound of all. The faint, muffled sobs of a little boy, alone in the dark. Julian saved the file, his hands shaking with a fury so cold it felt like ice in his veins. This was the weapon. This was the truth. But he knew he needed more than just a video. He needed to understand the boy's experience from the inside. He found his opportunity a few days later. He saw Leo sitting alone on the back steps, a rare moment of solitude. Julian walked to the edge of his property with a sketchbook and a box of high-quality colored pencils. He set them on the stone wall. "For the artist," he said simply, and walked away without waiting for a response. For 2 days, the art supplies sat untouched. Then, on the 3rd day, Julian saw Leo retrieve them. The boy began to draw. At first, Julian couldn't see the results. But one windy afternoon, a page from the sketchbook blew across the lawn and came to rest against Julian's fence. He retrieved it. His blood ran cold. It wasn't the drawing of a happy 5-year-old. It was a small, stick-figure boy, colored in blue, standing in a black, scribbled box. Outside the box was a very large, angry stick figure, colored in red, with its mouth open in a jagged scream. There were no windows on the box, only a door with a big, black lock. It was a child's rendering of a prison cell. It was Leo's silent testimony. With the video, Mrs. Gable's statement, and now the drawing, Julian had a powerful arsenal. He called his lawyer, Evelyn Reed, a woman whose courtroom demeanor was legendary for its surgical precision. He laid out the evidence on the polished mahogany of his conference table. Evelyn watched the video, her face grim. She looked at the drawing, her professional composure cracking for just a moment. "This is monstrous," she breathed. "But Marcus will fight it. He'll paint you as an obsessed, reclusive billionaire with a vendetta. He'll make Eleanor out to be a victim of your harassment. Then we don't give him the chance to fight it in the shadows," Julian said. his voice hard as steel. We drag him into the brightest light imaginable. We don't just take him down. We dismantle his entire world, so he can never hurt anyone again. Evelyn's eyes lit up with a familiar fire. What do you have in mind? Julian leaned forward. His charity gala. The one for the Children's Wellness Fund. He's the keynote speaker. It's in 3 days. A slow, predatory smile spread across Evelyn's face. Oh, that's just perfect. They moved with ruthless efficiency. Evelyn filed an emergency custody petition on Julian's behalf, citing imminent danger to the child, and scheduled it for the morning after the gala. She prepared a comprehensive evidence package for the police and child protective services to be delivered concurrently with the events at the gala. She coached Mrs. Gable, reassuring her that she would be protected. Julian, meanwhile, leveraged his considerable influence. He made a few quiet calls to the board members of the charity, to the journalists he knew would be covering the event. He didn't give them the details, only a cryptic warning. If you want a real story about Marcus Thorne, be at the Grand Ballroom on Friday night. And keep your cameras rolling. Marcus, oblivious, was riding high. The gala was the culmination of his efforts to rebrand himself as a philanthropist and community leader, a benevolent figure worthy of Eleanor's wealth and social standing. He felt invincible. He even grew careless. The day of the gala, Julian's microphones picked up a chilling conversation. Marcus was on the phone with an associate, laughing. Yeah, the kid's a pain, but he's the golden ticket. Eleanor's wrapped around my finger. Once we're married and I'm on the trust, we're selling the house and moving to the Caymans. She and the brat can have a nice, quiet life while we have some fun. It was the final nail in his coffin. Julian recorded it, his resolve hardening into something unbreakable. The Grand Ballroom was a sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. Champagne flowed, and the air buzzed with self-congratulatory chatter. On a large stage at the front of the room, Marcus Thorne stood at the podium, bathed in a warm spotlight. He was in his element, exuding charm and sincerity. Eleanor sat at a front table, looking up at him with adoring, hollow eyes. And that is why we must protect the most vulnerable among us, Marcus was saying, his voice resonating with practiced emotion. Because a child's innocence is the most precious resource we have. We must be their champions, their guardians, He trailed off. A figure had emerged from the back of the ballroom and was walking calmly, deliberately, down the center aisle. It was Julian Vance. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his presence sucking the air out of the room. The ambient chatter died. Every eye turned to him. Marcus's smile tightened. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have an uninvited guest. Security? He said, trying to sound dismissive. Could you please escort this man out? He's been unwell. A troubled neighbor, 2 burly security guards started to move towards Julian. But he simply held up a hand, and they stopped, hesitant to cross an invisible line of authority he projected. Julian reached the foot of the stage and looked up at Marcus, his expression unreadable. You speak so eloquently about protecting children, Mr. Thorne. It's truly inspiring. Get him out of here, Marcus hissed, his composure beginning to fray. He's trespassing. I don't think so, Julian said, his voice calm but amplified by the microphone still live on the podium. I think the guests and donors of the Children's Wellness Fund have a right to know exactly who they're celebrating tonight. From his jacket pocket, he pulled a small, sleek tablet. With a tap of his finger, a sound filled the ballroom's state-of-the-art speaker system. It was Marcus's voice, distorted by rage. You're pathetic. Why can't you do anything right? No wonder your real father left. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's face went white. Marcus lunged for the podium's controls, but Julian was ready. He tapped the screen again, and the massive projection screens on either side of the stage, which had been displaying the charity's logo, flickered to life. The entire ballroom was now watching the grainy but undeniable video from Julian's hidden camera. They saw Marcus forcing a small, crying boy to stand on an injured ankle. They saw the child collapse. They heard his sobs. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of a champagne flute shattering as someone dropped it. This is fake, Marcus stammered, his face slick with sweat. It's doctored. He's trying to frame me. But the damage was done. The mask had not just slipped. It had been incinerated. As if on cue, the ballroom doors opened. But it wasn't more security. It was Mrs. Gable, flanked by Evelyn Reed. She walked to a microphone that a stagehand, acting on Julian's prior instructions, had set up. Her voice, though trembling, was clear and strong. "It's not fake," she said. "I've heard him. For months. I've heard that little boy cry." The final, devastating blow came from the screens. Julian swiped, and the video was replaced by a high-resolution image of Leo's drawing. The little blue boy in the black, locked box. The giant, screaming red man outside. It was a masterpiece of silent accusation, more powerful than any spoken word. The truth was undeniable, rendered in the heartbreaking simplicity of a child's crayon. That's when Marcus broke. His carefully constructed world had crumbled in less than 5 minutes. The charm vanished, replaced by a raw, snarling rage. "It was the kid!" he screamed, his voice cracking, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. "He's a liar, a manipulative little monster. He deserved it. He deserved every bit of it." He lunged towards Julian, but the 2 security guards, their allegiance instantly shifted, intercepted him, pinning his arms behind his back. At that moment, 2 uniformed police officers, also prearranged by Evelyn, walked calmly down the aisle. The flash of handcuffs under the ballroom lights was the final, public seal on his fate. As they led him away, a pathetic, raving mess, he shot one last look at Eleanor. It was a look of pure hatred. In that moment, she finally saw him for what he was. Her face crumpled, and a single silent tear traced a path through her perfect makeup. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Marcus Thorne was charged with child abuse and endangerment. The audio of his phone call, admitting his scheme to defraud Eleanor, added fraud and conspiracy charges. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence, he was convicted and sentenced to a long prison term, his name becoming a byword for predatory deceit. His social and financial ruin was total. Eleanor, shattered and ashamed, cooperated fully with the authorities. In the quiet, sterile environment of a courtroom, away from Marcus's influence, she finally confessed her fear, her weakness, and her profound failure to protect her son. She willingly relinquished custody of Leo to Julian, acknowledging that she needed intensive therapy before she could ever hope to be a proper mother again. It was a tragic, painful, but necessary act of redemption. Julian sold the stone manor, its halls too full of his own ghosts and the fresh specter of the evil next door. He bought a house far away, a modern home with wide windows that overlooked the ocean. It was a place of light and air and the soothing, constant rhythm of the waves. He and Leo started a new life, a quiet one built on a foundation of patience and safety. There were no commands, only invitations. No expectations, only acceptance. For weeks, Leo remained mostly silent, communicating with his drawings, which slowly began to include color, sunlight, and a second, larger stick figure that always stood protectively beside the smaller one. The healing was slow, a delicate process of rebuilding a world that had been systematically destroyed. The breakthrough came one evening at sunset. They were walking on the beach, the sand cool beneath their bare feet. Leo had been collecting shells, his small brow furrowed in concentration. He stopped and held up a perfect spiraled conch shell. He walked over to Julian, reached up and placed the shell gently in his hand. Julian's heart ached with a sudden, overwhelming love. He knelt down to the boy's level. "It's beautiful, Leo," he said softly. Leo looked up, his eyes clear and direct for the first time. He reached out a small hand and touched Julian's cheek. Then, in a voice as clear and pure as a bell, he spoke. "We're home," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a declaration of safety, a recognition of sanctuary. And then he did something he hadn't done in over a year. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. Some say that evil is a loud, bombastic force, but so often it thrives in the quiet places, behind pristine doors, in the whispered words of a manipulator, in the silent complicity of those who are too afraid to speak up. It feeds on silence. But this story reminds us that goodness can be quiet, too. It can be the steady watchfulness of a neighbor, the silent vow of a protector, the unspoken testimony of a child's drawing. True strength isn't found in the power to dominate, but in the will to protect. It is the unwavering courage to step out of the shadows and bring a hidden evil into the blinding, cleansing light, proving that one quiet, determined voice can be enough to save a life. What are your thoughts on this story? Have you ever witnessed a situation where your intuition told you something was wrong, even when everything looked perfect on the surface? We would be honored to hear your stories and reflections in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and may we all find the courage to be a light in someone else's darkness.